Hey, hi everyone. It's good to see you here. Thanks for logging on to the session. Hey, Lyndon, good to see you here. Robert, as usual, nice and early. Hey, Wesley. We'll just wait a few seconds for everyone else to jump onto the call. Hey, Snyder. Hello, sales superstar. Hey, Amit. Hello, Fiona. Looks like you're going for a morning walk or perhaps to work. Okay. All right. Well, let's get cracking into it. I'll start with the disclaimer, like I always do. So by continuing on this call, you agree that any information provided by me on this call or any call is provided as general information and for general information purposes only. I've not taken your personal and financial circumstances into account when providing information. The information is not intended to imply any recommendation about any particular financial product or class of financial products and should not be reasonably be regarded as being intended to have such an influence. The information provided must be verified by you prior to acting or relying on the information by an independent professional advisor, including a legal, financial, or taxation advisor. And the information may not be suitable or applicable to your individual circumstances. All right, cool. Well, with that being said, thanks for attending, everyone. Today we'll just be doing Q&A like for the whole time. So I'll introduce the session a bit better in a second or two, but I just want to say if you've got questions, please start opening up the Zoom chat box and putting in your questions in the Zoom chat box. And so that hopefully we can populate that with lots of questions and make the session this morning really fruitful and productive and helpful, which is of course the intent. So the process by which, if you're new, we do these sessions, we start off with a monologue or a member deal. Today I'm just doing Q&A. Everyone can ask questions at any time in the chat. You just open it up and I'll try to get through all of them. You can ask about any particular week of the course as long as you've done that particular part of the week. If you're asking about a suburb, try to be specific as to which suburb which factor, sorry, you're not sure about, because, we obviously can't go through 35 factors for every suburb. And please don't be shy. I'm genuinely here to help you. So please ask anything at all. There's really no such thing as a silly question. Like I always say, congratulations to everyone who's bought over the last week since we did the session last week as well. The purpose of these sessions is to support and guide you so you can get the best results from the course. So please ask lots and lots of questions. Of course, all my clients, all you guys are welcome to attend every single Tuesday that happens at 8 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, or Brisbane time, not to be confused with Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, which is Sydney time. And if you're new to the course, before I start taking your questions, and guys, please do, start asking your questions, I'll just share the community forum, which is another place where you can get help, which is another place where you can get a lot of support. So let me share my screen real quick. All right. Okay, so you should be able to see the community forum right here. So when you log on to the course, you'll see the course and also the community, not to be confused with the Facebook group. And you can see here it's incredibly active, like, almost every week has like thousands of questions and answers. And, the thing is that you'll probably find your question is already answered here if you use the search the community function, put in some keywords, whether it's about negotiation or a suburb or even a street or particular professionals, or what have you. So your answers are probably going to be there on demand. But if you're not sure, you can just click onto a particular, let's say onto week 3 property selection and see what other people are asking. You can of course ask your own question here as well, but you can see here. That Prabjot has asked this question and it's been answered here. You can see all these sorts of things. So yeah, please go through them, keep your finger on the pulse, and you'll be able to get a lot of benefit. Every single question gets answered within 24 to 48 hours. So it's not like one of those community forums where your question might just go into into nowhere. And the other thing I want to just talk you through is where all these sessions are recorded and archived. So they're in the weekly mentorship call recordings, which is after the wrap-up section of the course. And if you scroll all the way down, you can see last week on the 8th of October, we had one of our members, Jay, take us through how he's rent vesting and how that's allowed him to buy 6 properties in 12 months. And he took us through how his plan for the next 6 months, and then how he's ultimately going to convert the rent vesting strategy into his principal place of residence. Before that, we had Q&A. Before that, we had Imesh take us through how he bought 2 WA properties in 2 months after 4 failed offers. I always say, I said this last week, and I always say this, it's really interesting to hear both the successes and hardships or challenges that members go through, because we can then all learn from them. So I think it's really interesting if you're failing or you're missing out on offers, to go watch this session and learn the lessons that he's sharing. Prashant take us through how he bought 4 properties in under 1 year, and in his own words, with like relative ease. So if you're finding it difficult, watch that session, reach out to Prashant in our community forum, and that might unblock something from you. Reese, how he bought 4 properties since 2022, and he had a real positive cash flow necessity. So he bought dual occupancy type properties so he can afford to continue holding and buying more properties. Before that, in August, we went through the most interesting suburbs above 500 and below 500K, as we do quarterly. So, there's always lots of questions about suburbs. If you're new to the course, if you're back after a year or 2 years, you're ready for your next property, please go back and listen to these 2 sessions, because they'll hopefully instill a lot of confidence in you and give you a steer as to where you should be looking. But anyway, like I said at the start, please ask lots and lots of questions. And so far we have like 5 or 6, so hopefully many, many more come through as well. So let's start with the first one. Ash, hi PK, as you know, banks often let you borrow again and look favorably on you if your previous investment property are positively geared. If previous investment property have been purchased under your personal name, how does the bank calculate if it is positively or negatively geared? Typically, when you borrow under your own name, the bank asks for the most recent monthly rental income statement and would know the mortgage repayment amount if the loan is with the same bank. But all of the other expenses, like rates, insurance, management fees, are not shared with the bank. So how do they determine the gearing of the property without having or asking for all the information? It's a really good question, Ash, and I think it's actually a little bit of a misnomer. So just because a property is positively geared, that doesn't actually mean that you can that increases your borrowing capacity, if you know what I mean. Because what they're looking for is in their, it's like they're putting on their lens of what your borrowing capacity ought to be using various serviceability parameters. For example, they look at your rental income, but they shade it often by 20, sometimes more percent. So they're not looking at your entire rental income. Another thing is that they assume, let's say in terms of your household expenses, even if you're living really frugally, let's say I'm just making this up, $2,000 a month. I know that a lot of the big banks have a minimum of like 3.5 or maybe even $4,000 a month, depending on where you live in the country, as a minimum as to what your living expenses are. So even if the reality is less than that, they'll assume that your real expenses are actually more than that. They also use, and this is the biggest thing, they use a 3% buffer in terms of interest rate when calculating your serviceability. So let's say the real interest rate you're paying on the property is 6%. They're actually using 9%, which of course it's not. And that's a requirement set upon them by APRA, which is the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, to basically safeguard lending and make sure there's no hugely irresponsible lending going on, which actually makes Australian the Australian property market and the banking system very resilient and robust. And that's why we saw, as interest rates rose, that here banks and house prices didn't really, go down that much or at all in some places, which can't be said for places like New Zealand, the UK, and to some extent the US, Canada, etc. So these things are all there to preserve the health of the economic environment. And therefore the reality of your serviceability is is probably different from what you think it is. Now, of course, you can go to tier two or tier three lenders, which are not deposit-taking institutions that you can't, deposit your money with them and receive interest in return, and they're therefore not regulated by APRA. And they don't often have this like 3% buffer rule. Their shading may be different. All these things might be different for them. In fact, they are different for them. And therefore, they're able to lend you more. So this is really a good question. Hopefully, I mean, Kevin's given you the short answer in the comments as well. Hopefully, I've kind of illuminated it for you. But I think to go into the weeds, it's really important, I think, to ask this to your mortgage broker and see which bank is good for you. I think in terms of real yield, real gross yield, you need like a 11 or maybe even 12% yield for the bank to consider it truly positive cash flow, given all this conservative nature of their serviceability calculators. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's why we try to buy a maximum yield as possible without sacrificing capital growth, because even though in the short term it's not going to improve our borrowing capacity, it's going to do the least to deteriorate our borrowing capacity. And as the years go by, as rents rise, etc., of course interest rates fall hopefully as well in the near future, then your borrowing capacity becomes more and more unlocked. Next one, Raj. Hi PK, would you buy a townhouse in a large regional center like Toowoomba, etc., with a population of 150,000? Do you think it's densely populated enough? And if I do buy a townhouse there, would it make a difference buying closer to the town's CBD versus outskirts? It's a really good question, and I think the way that I'd answer it is, if let's say your budget is 500K or is 550K or 600K, the way that I approach things is that I want to be looking at all of Australia, all of the 15, 16,000 suburbs available to see if the data is robust enough in any location for me to buy a detached house. Now, when I'm not able to buy a detached house, that's when I pivot into a townhouse. That's how I approach it. Other people, like a lot of members here, have also bought townhouses in places like Brisbane for 600K, for 650K, some even 700K, like in the Gold Coast, even though there are detached houses available in other parts of the country for less than that. And that's because their strategy was very much, I want exposure to Brisbane, or I want exposure to the Gold Coast for whatever reason there may be. So if you're sort of saying to yourself, I want more exposure to Toowoomba, I can't buy a detached house anymore because they're far too expensive, then with that perspective, I would say, yeah, that's probably the only option you have. But if you're not fully diversified yet and you can buy in another state for the same price range, it's probably beneficial to buy a detached house. Um, so I think that's kind of my perspective on it in terms of a broader strategic outlook. And in terms of your second part of that question, do you think densely populated enough? Toowoomba is sufficiently populated, and it's also sufficiently diversified in its economic drivers to not be fearful of a sudden fall, if one single industry becomes weak. So I think that's a good thing for Toowoomba. In terms of buying closer to the town CBD versus outskirts, that really has no impact on capital growth in terms of detached houses. I'll be honest with you, I've not done the analysis because I've not found enough resilience or depth in the data to be able to figure out, okay, in terms of townhouses, you know, does proximity to the CBD matter or not matter? It doesn't matter for detached houses. This data is really difficult to do because oftentimes you get large clusters of townhouses, not in Toowoomba per se, but let's say in Brisbane, where you have like 200 townhouses in a campus or in a complex. And so their subdued capital growth, you know, it kind of prevents the data for townhouses at a whole to be insightful enough to draw these types of conclusions. So I don't have a data-driven answer for you in terms of that second part of your question. So I think my approach of that would be to ask local agents and just ask, hey, you know, over the last 5, 10, 15 years, you've been working here, ask local property managers, do you find there to be any, you know, really any correlation in terms of tenant demand, owner-occupied demand for townhouses closer to the CBD versus not? I would suspect not, because Toowoomba is a small place and commute times aren't that material. So yeah, those are my perspectives. Stefan, hi PK team, had a couple questions. What would be considered to be low job diversity in a suburb if we're to take professional ABS data for percentages? Example, over 20% in one industry, asking for the suburb of South Kalgoorlie, mining town, but mining diversity has increased as well as job diversity slowly increasing. Okay. So yeah, we have our percentage as I teach you in week 2 of the course in terms of how many, you know, in terms of that professional side of things. But I think what you're asking is like, in terms of different industries, what is the maximum a single industry can be? I don't have any sort of hard and fast rule of thumb on that, but in the back of my mind, I sort of have a figure of like 30 to 35%. You know, if there's one and I wouldn't say it's job type, but rather industry, right? So if mining contributes 35, 40%, then if that industry halves because iron ore goes down or coal prices, thermal coal, coke and coal goes down, then you know, half of, let's say 30% is 15. So 15% of the market is completely wiped out, and just using broad brush assumptions here. So that's how I see it. Kalgoorlie is fairly mining dependent. I don't know the data for Kalgoorlie off the top of my head, but yeah, over 30% would be a clear no. Over 20% in terms of what you're quoting is kind of more acceptable. But once again, if you try to see the context, are the other industries that make up the balance of 80%, are they also just like 2 or 3 industries or 4 industries having, you know, another 20, 20, 20, 20? Or are there more of a plethora of industries that, you know, comprise of 5% here, 8% there, 9% here? You know, we really want the latter to be as diversified, as insulated to downside as possible. And your second question, is a house around 450 meters squared land area all right? I bought it at a good price. If bought at a good price, or will that greatly affect growth? The location I'm looking at doesn't have much price difference between a 500-meter square property and an 800-meter square property with similar conditions and layer 4 to 5 factors. Based on the CMA, it seems the condition of the house plus any new renovations tend to affect the suburb more. In your experience, are there certain suburbs where land area isn't a big factor for growth? There are many suburbs where the absolute land size cannot be said to, you know, determine growth. I always use this example. I've always said it for years and years. I have one in a suburb called Islington or Islington, depending on how you pronounce it, in Newcastle, and it's like 210 square meters, but it's quite, you know, the suburb is quite close to the city center. It's quite a densely populated suburb. And a lot of the houses there are sub 300, sub 400, sub 500. I mean, you're not going to find your average 607 square meter block in that suburb anymore. You know, because they've all been subdivided, and even back in the day, they were small to begin with. So like I always say, it's the land to asset ratio that matters the most. Now, it's very peculiar that you're saying that you know, there's no difference between an 800 meters squared versus, let's say, a 450 meters squared property. I would, you know, that may be the truth. But I'd want to just stress test that a little bit as well, because I've not often come across case studies like that. So I would ask a few other sales agents and get their opinion on this, not the one that's trying to sell you the property, but some others. And in terms of your CMA, try to go back, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. If it's Kalgoorlie that you're talking about, or like a small suburb in some very small regional area, then if this is the case, it can be a symptom of a more volatile market where the people that are there, they're quite transient. They're looking for the specs in the house, like the renovation, etc., as opposed to the size of the block. So those are some thoughts. And yeah, I would really want to stress test that before you jump in. Wesley, does wooden uh does a wooden house or brick house matter while choosing a property? No, in my mind it doesn't matter, and that's why I haven't included it in week three property factors. Of course, brick is always nice, right? No one's going to say it's not nice, as is like stone masonry, etc. But I myself have like predominantly weatherboard houses in my portfolio, so it doesn't really affect the capital growth. And so far, for me at least, it hasn't affected maintenance, although maybe if I hold them another 10 or 20 years at some point, the weatherboard houses over a 10-year period, a decade period, probably incur a high maintenance cost, let's say, $3,000 to $7,000, depending on the size of the house. But yeah, it's not really material in the context of things. Hmm. Carlo is asking, hi PK, can we still buy under 400K with good data for standalone house? Yes, so just like I said at the start of the session in August, I went through our quarterly update of the most interesting suburbs around Australia, and I think there were a handful of suburbs under 400K, perhaps even under 350K, but definitely not under 300K anymore from memory. Um, Um, Kevin is asking, what percentage of properties do you think that PK clients purchase on market versus off market? So I really like Ash's answer in terms of that percentage doesn't really matter because ultimately it comes down to the quality of the property. As you guys may know, sometimes you can get really fantastic off-market deals, and sometimes you can get really terrible off-market deals, and they're off-market for a reason, because if they were to be sold on market, they probably would become stale, and an educated buyer wouldn't buy them. But to give you the answer, it's around 30%. It used to be much higher. Like I think the first few years I operated, kind of leading into the 2020s, it was up sort of 60%. These days it's about 30, I would say 30-ish%. And that's simply because, in the last 3 years, this listings have become smaller and smaller and smaller. Like right now, we have record low listings in a lot of parts of Australia. And so when you have less listings, there's a tendency for there to be less off-market deals. Now, of course, a lot of, as you guys know, I'm not here to preach to the converted, but a lot of buyers agents will say, oh, 8 out of 10 of our deals are off-market, 5 out of 10 of our deals are off-market. It's very easy to get an off-market deal if you consistently overpay for properties, but of course, we don't want to do that. JS, hi PK, a question about capital growth. I own a 50-year-old house on the fringes of town, and there are hundreds of newly built houses across the road which are priced significantly higher than my house. How would this impact the capital growth of my house? Would the higher prices of the new houses lift my house value, or would the increased supply hinder capital growth? Um, so I think you're saying there are already hundreds of newly built houses across the road. So they're already there. So, the supply is already there. And I'm just going to make the assumption here, if they're already there, they're already sold and inhabited, which means that the supply is already baked in. If there were hundreds to be built, um, then that would be a cause for concern. But it seems to me that they're already there. And the most important thing to consider here is that what is their land quotient? What is their land um, size on average? Generally, these days, at least for the developers to make the commercials work, you really need to build houses on like, 3 to 450 square meter type blocks. And so if those houses are more expensive than yours, and let's say yours is, like you're saying, 50 years old, it's probably on 607, 800 square meters, 750 square meters, something like that, then that's a really good thing for your property because in 10 years' time, those new houses with the quality of build that exists these days, they're going to deplete in terms of depreciation of the build, but also like that new appeal will fade very fast. And so then they'll have no competitive advantage versus yours. And then it will come down to, okay, well, which are the bigger houses? All right, which hold more intrinsic value, and that'll be your house. So that's a good long-term structural advantage for you. Harish, good morning, PK. Please provide your feedback on South Kalgoorlie. Short-term factors for South Kalgoorlie are looking impressive because it has many businesses like mining, hospitality, tourism, and is close to Boulder, but not sure about long-term factors. However, I'm still taking some baby steps on Dysart. So I think someone asked about Kalgoorlie before. Maybe you can connect with them as well. But really, the most important long-term, of course, I teach the long-term factors in week 2 of the course. So you should just go through them, and a lot of them are quantifiable, like the income growth story versus the state average, etc. So I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but to the point that we were discussing before, long term, we really want to make sure it's diversified. Okay, so hospitality and is great. Tourism is great as well. But both hospitality and tourism can be quite volatile. Let's say the Australian dollar rises in value versus other currencies, the global economy is weak, etc. Mining, of course, can be volatile, so we don't want huge exposure to that. Try to understand what other kind of foundational industries it holds. Like, is there a big public sector or admin? Like local council, do they hire a lot of people, employ a lot of people? What's like the foundation? If some of these volatile industries go down, what else is keeping it afloat over the long term? All right, so try to investigate more into that. And generally, just going to the council website is going to be helpful for you, and also just calling the council. They're going to be helpful, especially in a small place like this. Kerry, hi PK, just started your course last week. Welcome, Kerry. My mortgage broker has come back with a rate for first investment property. However, it's based on principal and interest. For interest only, it's 20 basis points higher. Would this be an exception or still focus on interest only? Um, well, it looks like Kevin might be a mortgage broker. He seems to have tried to answer your question as well. But kind of zooming out, like even just maybe 2 years ago, the difference between the interest rate on principal and interest only used to be like 100 basis points, or it used to be much higher than this. Right now, with the net interest margins of banks becoming eroded, they're really vying for everyone's business. And so therefore, it's really tempting, I would say, to go for principal and interest sorry, let me read this. It's based on principal. For interest only, yeah. So on this case, because interest only is only 20 basis points higher, it works in more of your favor. Normally we go on interest only, but it's a higher interest rate. But of course, interest only allows us to preserve our own capital and use it for the next property, that create that deposit for the next property faster because you're not paying down principal. And you normally are penalized for that. You're paying a higher interest rate. But here it's basically the same. 20 basis points is nothing. So that's even more tempting to go on interest only. Now, of course, you have to assess this. How quickly do you want to buy that next property? If you want to be really aggressive, you're kind of got like 30K saved up and you want to really accelerate your savings up to, let's say, 50, 60, 70K to buy that next property, then interest only will help you, it will help your cause. But if you're saying to yourself, look, I either can't afford or have no intention of buying another property for at least a year or two, then perhaps principal and interest is better for you, Kerry, because you can at least save that, something, 20 basis points, save something. And you can always refinance in a year or 2 year. 2 years to take that principal back out that you put in, to avail the lower interest rate. And then, you can use that as equity plus savings to then buy the next property. So don't think you're locked in just because you've gone principal interest. You can always refinance that principal back out, through equity, in the future. So those are some considerations, but your mortgage broker should also go into further detail. Next one, the shortlisted suburbs are coming up in Mackay, and they're within the building approvals thresholds, but the town plan has said there are medium density blocks in each suburb that may be subdivided later. Samir had also mentioned in the video call about lots of building approvals, thus feel less confident about these suburbs. What do you think about Mackay? The cooler suburbs like Grafton, Albury, etc. have grown more than 8% in the last 10 years, so those markets are off the list now, in addition to all Queensland suburbs being so hot. Yeah, I think Mackay's okay. It really depends on the quantum of those medium density blocks that may be subdivided, but it's unlikely to be in like the multiple hundreds in the next 1 or 2 years, given, of course, Mackay is not such a huge place. So yes, that's a consideration, but I don't think personally that the shift from medium density to kind of that subdivision potential is going to cause a glut of supply in the market, especially right now with builders. Kind of the construction cost is very high. Before it used to cost like $1,500 a square meter to build a house. Now it's at least $2,500 a square meter. It's gone up so much. So even though they have subdivision potential, I don't see there being hundreds of those blocks being subdivided and built upon in the short term. So I think it's okay. John, you're saying, hi PK, struggling. I've done the course, but now putting off implementing. Yeah, John, thanks for being here, by the way. I think if you tune into these sessions, hopefully you get some inspiration, especially when we do like the client interviews almost on a weekly basis. Hopefully that provides you some inspiration as well. But feel free to ask lots of questions as to where you're struggling, why you're struggling, what you're struggling in. And like I always say, the more specific you can be as to like, okay, PK, this is not working for me, or I'm hitting a brick wall in this thing. Like the more specific you can be, the better I can help as well. Chris, hi PK, in the conditional phase of the contract, Building and Pest has come out with all okay, but no structural issues. House is 30 years old, 95 build. Building and Pest says drainage is inadequate, and agriculture drain pipe may be required to install. Building and Pest inspector mentioned it's a minor issue, but a licensed plumber needs to inspect, and if not fixed, can cause structural issues. Land is on a slight slope towards the road, not extensive slope in Victoria. I spoke to plumbers and described the issue from the report, and they told it could cost 2 to 4K, but they need to physically inspect to give the exact quote. Would this be a deal breaker? Not sure if it could take more than 4K, and it is the conditional phase. The plumber can't inspect until it goes unconditional. Chris, I'm very conservative and I don't like to take risks unnecessarily around things that I can control. There are things that you can't control, and therefore you have to take educated risks, and that's called investment. Risk equals return, but we try to reduce the risk and maximize the return in those things that we can't control. This is something you can control. So what I would do is I would go to the agent, the selling agent, and say, I'm not satisfied with this Building and Pest report. I assume you put that clause into the contract. I will be satisfied if you permit a plumber to go in and do the plumbing check, his inspection, the more deep dive on the drainage. If you're not allowing me to do that, then it'll exit the property. That's what I would do. You may have a more liberal risk tolerance to me and take what they are saying at face value and say it could cost 2 to 4K. But I know from my experience, sometimes they say that ends up being 8K, or sometimes they say that ends up being $200. We just don't know. So unless from a cash flow perspective, 8K is not an issue for you, 6K is not an issue for you, worst case scenario, then best to mitigate risk in the field of activities that you can control. And so that would be my approach. Robert, hi PK. How do you assess and treat suburbs that have overall really favorable data factors across most areas, but have one particular factor that is weak? For example, Malvern, Victoria units at the moment has very strong data factors for most, except household income, which is only growing at 13.89%, whereas Victoria is growing at 23.96%. Or another example, Epping has very strong data factors for most points, except has lots of vacant land supply to the north of the suburb. Are these factors or any other data points that you have a blanket rule that you just stop assessing that suburb altogether? Thanks again. Really good question. And I think we've had members on previously who have kind of also shared how they've made these trade-offs. So I think point number one, it's important to be able to make trade-offs. And I've given you the importance levels in terms of what's most important, but I think it's very important for everyone to know there's no such thing as a perfect suburb or a perfect property. In terms of your specific example, where there is a lot of vacant land to the north or to whatever direction, that's like a red flag for you to do further due diligence. And that further due diligence is, of course, to see building approval numbers and then just call council. Yeah, you can call the council maybe 3 or 4 times, or maybe that's overdoing it, 2 or 3 times on different days, talk to different town planners and ask, oh, what's your plans for that vacant land supply? Is it going to be rezoned? Do you want it to be, high density, medium density, low density? What are your plans? And they may give you some insight which allows you to make more of a calculated assessment. But generally, vacant land in of itself isn't a turnoff for me. It's what they say over the phone or what the building approvals numbers are. In terms of the household income, which is only growing at 13.89%, that's something definitely to, that's like a cross against that suburb, but that's not a deal breaker. So then what I would try to understand is, all right, is there anything different about this suburb now versus presumably like since 5 years ago, since the last census, that could suggest it's structurally changing, right? And that it could be that it's had a really bad 5 years. And so the census that you're probably considering is the 21 one. Um, and so Victoria leading up to 2021 in general was pretty poor as well. The preceding 5 years, it wasn't the best time for Victoria either. The state in terms of it as a state. Of course, post-COVID, it got worse. But at the suburb level, or the LGA level, the local government area level, what's going on? So you can perhaps call the council and ask this question, or you can call local real estate agents, and it's not time consuming. Just ask a few and say, look, I just noticed that what type of people, what type of demographic lives in this suburb, and they may say something like, oh, look, typically it's blah, 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 blue collars, but now we're seeing a bunch of professionals moving, it's gentrifying. And that tells you, all right, well, we're right at the sort of pivot point or juncture of it changing its nature structurally. So you try your best, like there's no like perfect science as to how to figure this out, but you try your best using some of these methods that I've talked about, and then you make a calculated assessment. But if that's the only factor that is kind of bad, then it's not the end of the world. David, hi PK, would you classify a battle axe house as a townhouse? Would you rather buy a battle axe house or a townhouse in a small complex of 4 other townhouses? A good question. I've not been asked this one before. So normally a battle axe is where it used to be like a rectangular shaped block, and there was a house at the front and a big backyard at the back. And what they did is they subdivided the house, and the backyard they turned into its own title, and the front house has side access and has a driveway going back into the new house at the back that they built. That's a battle axe. And normally I always avoid those battle axe, the rear properties, because they have no privacy, they have no street appeal, they have no street frontage. You're paying for that driveway, which is useless. That's also included in its block size for that rear battle axe block. but the driveway is useless. Like, you're not really availing that for anything else than just going in or out. So they become quite inefficient, and tenants don't mind them, but owner occupiers don't always love them. So I try to avoid that. But townhouses in a pack of four are completely fine as long as it's meeting all the factors that, of course, that you know about. Then I have no issues with that. Yeah. So hopefully that gives you insight. Double, why in general it doesn't look like people are not buying in regional Victoria? There's a few negative. Why in general it doesn't look like people are not. So I think what you're asking is, why are people not buying in regional Victoria right now? Found few suburbs around Warrnambool where data looks good with little trade-offs. Just wanted to know if there's any reason people are avoiding Victoria. Generally for the land tax. Land tax is very high in Victoria. It's at least $1,000, if not 2,000, depending on, of course, the value of your property, your land. But recently, the land tax rates were shifted, and they're much higher. So that's one reason. Also, regional Victoria had a huge run in COVID because, of course, Melbourne was the most heavily locked down city in Australia, perhaps the world, I don't know. And so a lot of people went into regional Victoria, and that drove house prices really high. And so now they seem very, I don't want to say overcooked, but very, to some extent, very unaffordable to local people. Even though for us it may be, oh, that's still under 600K, under 700K, but for the local demographic, they're quite unaffordable. Or in turn, bring it back to the course, they've grown more than 50% in the last 3 years. So we avoid those ones. Ash, have you taken out property title insurance for any of your own investment properties, and would you recommend this is something worth purchasing? I've taken it out for my Burnie one in Tasmania. And that's because it was just like some doubt as to whether the fence was on the right position of the right perimeter of the actual block of land as per the title. So I took out title insurance just in case there was any disagreement with the neighbors, but nothing really came of it. But I think title insurance cost me, I think maybe it was $500 or something. So I don't regret taking it out. But for all the other, 10 odd properties, 10, 11 properties, I haven't taken it out because there was no ambiguity, in insofar as the the aspects or the things that title insurance covers. So I didn't see any reason for that. What are your thoughts on buying a house on the street where most of the houses are heritage listed and this house is not heritage under heritage zoning at this point? I don't really see any issues with that. Um, maybe you could do a double check and ask a few sales agents whether people prefer heritage houses in terms of buying heritage houses because of, I don't know, the prestige or some sort of romantic idea of having a heritage house. But I don't see it as being a problem. And in fact, if it's not heritage listed, that allows you to do more to the house in terms of if you ever wanted to structurally renovate it or change the facade or do anything like that. If it's heritage listed, those things are basically very difficult to do because the council wants to preserve the look and feel. But if yours is not that, it gives you more flexibility. Hello, PK. We've purchased a unit in Sydney before learning from your course. Do you recommend to sell and buy the house somewhere else? Okay, it looks like Kevin has been very helpful in helping everyone out. Thanks, Kevin. My general answer to this question, of course, I don't know exactly where you've bought and your financial circumstances, etc. My general answer to this question is try to exhaust your available resources in the way of savings. Of course, keep your buffers, but savings and borrowing capacity. Try utilize what you have and put it into the right assets. And when you're at your limit in terms of either borrowing capacity or savings for your next deposit, then you can go back to your portfolio and the incumbent assets and consider, does it make sense to redeploy your capital by selling one or two and buying, one or two in a different location? But if you let's say you've got $1 million of property that you can buy right now, two at 500K each, it's like while property prices are rising, you're kind of wasting time selling and then you reusing that. Better to use what you have and then come back to that later. And especially I'd recommend put that unit and that suburb through the week 2 system. It might be a good investment. You know, who knows? By unit, you might mean townhouse. I'm not sure. It might not be a high-rise tower or something. So it might be okay. Might not be too bad. Ben, does family trust classify as non-trading entity, even though we have a property under the trust? Oh, this is an accounting question, Ben. I don't want to give you the wrong answer. Sorry. And then I think your next, or that's a different Ben. Yeah, ask the accountants, Ben. They're in week 6 of the course download section. Ben, the other Ben is asking approximately how much more would you add to the valuation of a house with a 2-bay shed compared to one without it? House is 20 years old, shed is highly valued in this location, price point 500K. Um, I mean, the scientific way to do this is to actually get comparables and, with and without a shed, try and normalize the other factors and see, are they selling for more? Um, but a shed, yeah, it depends on who buys it. Some people don't value a shed, those who don't really want a powered workshop or don't have storage needs or have a boat or something like that. They don't value it, and so they wouldn't pay any more for it as a buyer, and other buyers would. So yeah, I don't I don't think I don't think it adds too much, to be honest. But from a tenant appeal, that can be a different story. And oftentimes property managers will tell you that if you can find the right tenant, once again, depends on who's interested, they can pay $50 more a week for a shed if they love that, they need that, they have, vehicles or whatever that require that. So yeah, a bit of a fluffy answer on that one, but it really does depend. And I wouldn't just go off willy-nilly and add 50K to the valuation or even 25K to the valuation just because it's got a shed. I'll let IPK the suburb selection analysis does not consider the volatility of natural disasters in the area. How should I make my decision, particularly looking to purchase at Gladstone area in Queensland, which is prone to bushfires and cyclones? Good question. So bushfires is a factor already taught in the course. It's in week 3 as a intra-suburb factor, a property selection factor. In terms of cyclones, look, I have property myself in Townsville. I have property myself in Cairns. Um, is there a direct correlation between a cyclone infested or cyclone impacted area and house prices over the long term? No, there's not. So, I mean, not just northern Queensland, but if we look at places like Sydney, you guys that live in Sydney, I think a year or 2 ago, you had huge floods. It wasn't a cyclone per se, but there was a lot of flooding. But we know those places have gone up historically over the last 30, 40 years, just as much as other areas. Same with other parts of the country. If you look at Townsville now and you see the price of Townsville and its percentage growth over the last 30, 40 years, it's really no different to Brisbane, to any other place, even internationally. Right now it just comes to mind, there's like that cyclone that's going on. It was just finished potentially in Florida in the US. Um, some of Florida's real estate, like Palm Beach, it's like the most expensive real estate in the US. So there's really no direct one-to-one correlation, and therefore it's not taught in the course. What is taught in the course is to get insurance and to budget for the right insurance premium and to make sure that you're okay with that from a yield perspective. And so I know in my Cairns property, I think I pay $2,500 or $3,000 a year, something like that, in insurance. And I'm okay with it because the yield is sufficiently commensurate. Thanks for that question. Next question, guys. Please don't direct message me because then, the whole idea is that everyone can see your questions and I can answer them. Next question is, do you expect a decline in property prices over the next 6 to 12 months? Yeah, 100%. I do expect a decline in property prices. In fact, right now, Melbourne as a whole is declining. ACT as a whole is declining. I think many other areas will be declining in the next 6 to 12 months, but then many other areas will be flatlining and many other areas will be going up double digits. So Yeah, that's always been the case. It will always be the case. Banks often let you borrow again and look favorably upon you if your previous invest. I think I already answered this question. Yeah, I think I already answered this question. Jamie, if there's a housing commission property on the same street but not a cluster, is it okay to proceed? I understand it depends on risk appetite, and ideally we would prefer to be 2 to 3 streets away, but is it recommended in this case? Um, I think it's fine. Yeah, if there's just one housing commission on your street, presumably it's not super rough, it's not like there's 10 burnt down cars in front of it. It's very unlikely that for that to be the case. No, it's fine. It's really like you mentioned, it's the clusters that we want to be careful of. Ravi, hi PK, suburbs that I have selected have very low stock. Is it wise to look into surrounding suburbs or stick to suburbs we have selected? Really good question here, Ravi. So yeah, cast your net wide, and therefore it'll be easier and faster for you to buy a property. So these boundaries that we put on suburbs, like on Google Maps or whatever, they're artificial boundaries. Just because one house is 10 meters away from the suburb that you've chosen down the same street, but technically in a different suburb, doesn't mean it's got a different outlook or profile to the one that's, 10 meters down on the other side of the street in the suburb that you're looking at. So surrounding suburb, like closer to your suburb, of course, is fine. And yeah, I know in the course I say 2 to 3 suburbs. If there's very low stock, as is the case in many parts of Australia, there's no harm in having 5 to 10 suburbs in your final shortlist, and there's really not much additional work, if they're all next to each other. Or you might have one cluster in, let's say Victoria in a particular part of Victoria, another cluster in a particular part of Queensland or another state. So yeah. Joe, hi PK, how crucial is privacy when considering valuation? For instance, a house that is visible from an elevated road and walkway, which provides unobstructed views of the house due to their height above the house, is definitely a factor. Hard to quantify. I don't think it's an incredibly um, strong consideration. Uh, the exceptions to what I've just said could be things like an alleyway. Like, let's say there's an alleyway right next to your house, like on the left, right, or back of your house. That would be a significant consideration. Like, I think that could almost like penalize the valuation by $50,000 because there might be some unwanted things in that alleyway at certain times of the day or night, and just safety, etc., like that, depending on which suburb it is, of course. But let's say another house can see your backyard because they're like on a bit of a hill or something like that. It's not really typically seen to impact valuations that much. I'm new here. Do you do quarterly hot suburb discussions like the one you did before in August? How often do you discuss the property market? In terms of the quarterly discussions, we do them quarterly, yeah, every 3 months. So it was August, so the next one is September, October, November will be next month. Yeah, and you can ask me any questions on any of these weekly calls about anything of the property market, really. Jags, hi PK, good morning. Is it possible to provide outlook on Melbourne commercial property market? Commercial is not really part of the course, and that's because I'm not an expert on commercial myself, so I don't want to answer that question for those reasons. Ravi, after week 2 suburb selection, mapping streets, do we jump real estate domain and start calling sales agents, or call top sales agents and putting us out there? What our requirements are? Yeah, do all three. Yeah, all three. And in fact, here's the thing that a lot of people should know, and you hopefully have learnt from listening to the mentorship calls where other members share their experiences. A lot of their off-market deals, pre-market deals, amazing deals, they happen when they've contacted an agent and they've actually missed out on the property, and then the agent kind of has that relationship with them. The agent knew that they were serious, had a pre-approval, gave offers, and so now they're top of mind for that next one. So go on real estate, go on domain, call the agents, but most importantly, start making offers. Like start making offers, even if you're not confident, just make mock offers, put them a little bit lower, knowing that you're not going to get the property, but start making offers. That's the best way to build relationships with the agents. Um, what What's the long-term outlook of Albury? Stock is very low and yield is decent. Yeah, I'm very bullish on Albury and Wodonga over the long term. Albury, Wodonga, as you know, are sort of sister cities, one in New South Wales, one in Victoria. It's a bit like Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. These areas are quite inland. Often investors don't consider them, but they're very diversified, strong economies. The population for, I think, Albury Wodonga is more than 100,000 combined. In fact, just as I was saying that, I remembered that in August, when I did go through the top suburbs, I did mention some areas in Albury, and I actually did a bit of an overview of Albury Wodonga at a sort of macro 20,000-foot bird's eye view type level. So a lot of those insights are there. I can't remember all the data off the top of my head in terms of that city outlook, but in short, yeah, it's not a one town sort of sorry, one trick pony. I think that's the analogy. It's quite diversified, strong over the long term. Amber, if someone had 1 million in the bank, would you still advise the course strategy of buying 6 houses on credit? Great question. So by buying $1 million house, you will be making let's say 4.5% net yield, because you'll have no debt. And so that's a lot of passive income. But if your goal is six-figure passive income, then that's not going to cut it, right? Because that's not enough. That's just $40,000 odd. And so therefore, by leveraging and buying more properties, you're holding a larger asset base. And when you're holding a larger asset base, let's say 6 properties, 500K each, that's 3 million. You're now controlling $3 million worth of assets using the bank's money as opposed to $1 million of assets. And even putting aside the course and everything I teach, let's say the Australian property market doubles, not over the next 7 years, let's just be conservative and say 10 years or even 15 years. Like, let's just be super pessimistic, 15 years. Then that 3 million goes to 6 million versus that 1 million goes to 2 million. So, the answer is pretty apparent on what most people would do who are kind of sophisticated or serious property investors. But once again, there's no right or wrong. So if you don't want debt and you're very risk averse and all you want is 20, 30, $40,000 of passive income, then you could just buy one $1 million property or two 500K properties, bit of diversification, but no debt. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Last few questions. Confirming the best policy if $100,000 extra cash, inheritance just received, but don't want to purchase a new investment property yet. Should we put into term deposit or put into offset of a $550,000 investment property house? I know you had advised to put where the highest rate is given, but not sure of the after-tax situation. So I can't give financial advice because I'm not allowed to, and this seems like a very financial advice type thing. But I think Kevin has basically given the answer that I would. So the interest rate, you generally put it into the area where the opportunity cost or the interest rate received is the highest. And so like, let's say your offset, is more, you'd put it in the offset account. But of course, by not putting it into the offset account, you're getting negative gearing benefits, depending on your LVR. And so you would say, okay, well, what's the difference between the interest rate received? Okay. And then you would say, okay, well, then let's subtract that by my tax savings loss. So if I put it into the offset account, I'm not availing negative gearing. Therefore, the loss of tax savings is this, and you subtract it by what I just mentioned earlier, the interest. and the same on keeping it into your savings account, because in your savings account it receives money or interest, therefore you pay tax on it. So it's just a mathematical formula, really, on each side, and it's just like a scale. So yeah, that's how you do it. Um, uh, Ali, please shed some light on Melton, Victoria. At a high level, Melton, Victoria has too much supply, and I wouldn't buy there. Lyndon, hi PK, with Granny Flats, is it a better, with Granny Flats, is it better built or one of those modular ones? Um, so good question. I mean, I don't know the answer. I'll be honest with you. I don't know the answer to this one. I think you need to reverse engineer in terms of what the demographic in that suburb wants or needs. So I would be calling the property manager of where my property is and asking this question to them, because they may say, uh, the built one can, even though it may be a little bit more expensive, may yield disproportionately higher rent, and therefore, it stacks up to invest in that and get that higher rent versus the modular approach. So, or if it's a really lower socioeconomic type of suburb, it might not matter. So it really depends on where you are, and you can talk to maybe two or three property managers if you're really wanting to improve your confidence and see what their consensus view is. All right, last question. It's rather large. Okay, maybe two more questions. I'm super excited to share that I've joined the course last week and finished week 2 as of today. It's been amazing. Thank you, Amit. Really enjoying it. Now, I have a quick question. Last week, I spoke with one of our mortgage brokers, and after assessing all factors, she mentioned that I have solid equity with my principal place currently at 584 P&L. She suggested the following steps. Um, I think it's better if you ask this question to me via email, because there's a lot of numbers and I can't sort of mentally remember all of them. But I think, once again, Kevin has kind of nailed it. So he said that mainstream banks such as Westpac give you the interest rate based on purpose of funds. So if you tell the bank that you are using for investment, they will give you the investment rates. Same with owner occupiers. So I think that answers the question, but if you do want me to answer it, please email me. And you can also give me more of your context of a kind of your personal situation, and I can try to steer you in the right direction. Okay, last question or two. In what scenario will you use a solicitor over a conveyancer, or should we just use conveyancers in general when buying properties? If it's a straightforward transaction, you don't anticipate any hairiness, um, any complexities, like it's not like you're not doing a subdivision, you're not buying multiple titles, you're not buying a development site, um, things like that, then a conveyancer is just fine. The added value of a solicitor is, if there's anything that you need to then litigate or take through the court system, and you need that additional value add from your legal professional, then it's all in-house. But I don't think I've ever used a solicitor myself for residential property. It's always just been conveyances. Ben, hi PK, in Townsville, the building and pest inspector always recommends the termite inspection. Should it be done? Oh, sorry, you're saying termite treatment. Should it be done? So I think, yeah. I know when I bought in Townsville, I didn't get a termite treatment done, and that's because there was no like wooden stumps or trees or anything of that sort around my property. It was just all concreted. So I didn't see it personally as a risk. Um, but in my Cairns property, as well as my Brisbane properties, and of course Gold Coast, etc., in some of them where there's a lot of tree foliage and a lot of like creepers and just a lot of soil and things like that. I've even gone as far as to put in baiting stations that cost like $4,000 around the house. That was for one of the big houses though. For standard, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, 600 square meter type block, it should cost less than $3,000 to set up baiting stations, and then they come and inspect them for you semi-annually or quarterly. You don't need to go in terms of like hardcore chemical barriers where they install like a pipe all around your house and then they inject that pipe with like chemicals and then they top up those chemicals. Like that is a bit overkill. But it depends on the risk. You know, if you don't, there's no huge trees, if there's no soils, if there's no parts of leaves or branches touching the side of your house, you know, if the drainage is fine, if there's no water pooling, if everything is to code, no exposed timber, etc., then, you know, personally, I've not done a termite treatment. So it really comes down to your risk appetite. Um, for those houses that I haven't done a termite treatment, I generally get a termite inspection done every 2 or 3 years just to be on the front foot in that way. But yes, I know some members do a termite inspection. Yeah, because they risk appetite sometimes. Well, I think I didn't cover maybe 6 or 7 questions. Um, but if you did ask one of them, please copy paste your question and put it into the community forum right now so that I can make sure that it gets answered over there and that you get the assistance that you need. Like I always say, I want each and every one of us to get fantastic property deals. So please ask lots and lots of questions. Please email me when you do secure deals. I always love to hear them. I think in the last week I got 7 or 8 emails. Starting now more so away from Queensland and Perth, which is nice. I think there was a moment, there was a period of time where like almost every deal was in Queensland or WA. So it's good to see, you know, as the data moves, we also move around. Please don't communicate with me on Facebook Messenger or Facebook group or SMS, WhatsApp, LinkedIn, Instagram, X, phone calls, etc. Keep it to these sessions, the private email for specific deals, and the community forum. If you weren't here from the very start, none of this was professional, personal, or financial advice. Please go back and watch or listen to that disclaimer. And good luck, guys. Happy hunting, and have a great day ahead. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, PK. Thank you.